Hi, my name is Casey Glass, and I'm here to give a quick lecture on creating copyright-friendly presentations. In our current area, most of our teaching material can be disseminated pretty widely and easily on the internet. And so if you're creating content that is digital in any way, it's really important to keep in mind how to create lectures and slide decks that are copyright-friendly. So we're going to get into what is copyright, how to create copyright-friendly presentations, and then especially with respect to the health sciences, what are some of the easy pitfalls that people can fall into when they create these presentations. So we'll go over again why it's important. I'll give you kind of a hypothetical to illustrate how you might accidentally get into some pretty significant trouble with copyright. And then we'll go some basics of copyright, and I'll actually have some example slides to show you how you can make mistakes and then how to correct them so that your copyright or your slide deck is copyright friendly. And then lastly, we'll look at health information in particular. So if you're teaching in the health sciences and you have patient related kind of content on your slides, how to be safe in terms of HIPAA. So quick disclaimer, I am not a lawyer. I'm a physician and I live in the United States of America, so most of this will be focused on laws as they pertain to the United States. And specifically, my name is Casey Glass, and I'm an assistant professor of emergency medicine at Wake Forest University School of Medicine here in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. And I've been teaching in the medical environment for almost 15 years now. And for the last several years, all of my slide decks have been copyright friendly. And I've taught on all kinds of content, from pretty generic medical content to very specific content in my own subspecialty area of expertise, which is ultrasound. And so I will demonstrate kind of different ways to do that and all the resources that are available to you to get content for your slide decks that is copyright friendly. So let me frame the problem a little bit for you. Historically speaking, lecturing was a very local process where you would take your expert knowledge and disseminate it to a large student body in a big lecture hall. Our slide decks used to be, little stacks of Kodachrome slides. And in fact, right outside my office, one of my colleagues has recently gotten rid of a bunch of their old slide decks. And so there's these carousels of transparencies. But nowadays, all of our slide decks are digital. We're using PowerPoint or Keynote or Google Slides or other things to make these presentations. And those things are all super shareable. I mean, it's just bytes on a hard drive, and it takes almost nothing to get them from your computer to someone else's. And so we really need to kind of keep that in mind, because most of our teaching environments these days are not big lecture halls. They could be kind of smaller small group working rooms, they could be Zoom online classes. And in all of those settings, we're taking a file and maybe even taking it to a different computer, or we're showing it to other students across the internet where they could be screen capturing your slides. And so you really should consider that any slide deck you make is going to make its way out onto the internet, could be found by people who are not your initial audience. And those people could disseminate your slide deck even further, and that's where you can get into trouble with copyright. So we're going to kind of look at some things, but let me give you a hypothetical situation. Let's say, for example, that you're an expert in virology, and by some happenstance there is a global disaster involving a viral agent. And you happen to be one of the few people who understand exactly how this particular family of viruses bind to human cells. And so as a good act of service to your community, you create an explainer video that kind of goes over how this virus works. And while you do that, you borrow a couple of images on its particular actions from a paper out of a journal and maybe a textbook. And so you put this up on YouTube, and it goes viral itself. So your video's being shared. It's been watched millions of times. You're going on talk shows to explain kind of how the virus works. And then unfortunately, you go ahead and get a letter from the lawyer for the representing the publisher of that textbook in that journal, saying they're upset about how you have taken the content out of their intellectual property and shared that across the internet. And they're suing for damages because they feel like people are not going to, buy that journal article or invest in that textbook now that you've shared the diagrams from their journal out widely across the internet via your YouTube video. And so really in a pretty innocent way, in ways that have the best of intentions, you can take people's intellectual property that's not yours and share it across the internet. And that has gotten people in trouble. If you Google professor copyright suit, there are a number of cases where professors are sued for sharing things. There's one interesting case where the professor is suing their students for sharing their things. And so it is a real problem. It's something that's pretty easy to avoid, and we'll look into that a little bit. So the first big common sense thing that people will grab onto when we talk about copyright is that by choosing to put things on the internet, people have willingly given up their copyright claims, and if we can find it on the internet, there must be free to use. If I just give attribution or credit, then that's enough to make it fair to use, and that is just not quite right. That kind of has a sibling claim, which is that, if there's no copyright notice on the thing I find on the internet, that it must be fair to use. So let's talk a little bit about what copyright is exactly. So copyright is a legal claim by the owner of a work, and that permits them to guide the use of that work. And the particular way this is protected will vary from country to country. And in the United States, it's enforced through civil tort. So you would get sued. You're not breaking a law. The police aren't going to come, but the copyright owner could sue you for misappropriating their work. An important point is that this exists from the moment of the creation of any work. So you do not need to file a notice with the U.S. government. You do not need to do anything particularly. As soon as you make something that's set down in some permanent form, you have copyright claim to that. And so oftentimes we feel like as educators that by virtue of the fact that we're doing education, that we can make use of those things for the purposes of education. And this falls into what is called in the United States fair use. So fair use is a legal exception to copyright, which will let people or the public use copyrighted content for some very particular purposes. So if it's newsworthy, if you are doing education, and I'll get into that a little bit more in a minute, or if you're making commentary or criticism on that. When we're talking about copyright and fair use, things that are creative or artistic generally are able to exercise a more restrictive claim than factual works. So for example, the score of a baseball game. Well, technically, that score may be the property of the organization that is sponsoring that. So they will publish it. They will set it down in some sort of permanent form, like this is the official score of the game. And technically they have copyright to that, but it is also newsworthy and factual, and so that is fairly easy to use elsewhere by making a fair use claim. Creative works are privileged in a way that they have somewhat more restrictive fair use abilities. So if things are creative, it's a little bit harder to make a fair use claim. You can't just reproduce part of a creative work and say that you're going to do that because it's newsworthy or things like that. So a great example would be if there's a photo, let's say an editorial photo of some sort of patient-physician encounter, and you're asking students to write an essay commenting on that photo. That would be a great example of fair use of an artistic work in the education environment. However, what we see most often in slide decks is this second example. People will take a photo and just use it as flair or kind of visual flavor in their slide deck and not really be making any editorial comments about it. And that is not a fair use exception to copyright. So if you're looking at your slides and you're seeing this kind of artistic type stuff like clip art or photos or other artistic things, if you are trying to make a fair use claim, really your use there needs to be editorial or instructional about that visual element itself. Other sorts of things we often use in slide decks, like factual data out of papers, we're much more easily able to make a fair use claim for because that's just factual data. And as long as we are limited in scope, we don't reproduce the entire article or all the pieces out of the article, then we can make a fair use claim. The last piece of this blurb right here, that we're going to use it for non-commercial purposes, is pretty important, and this gets into where oftentimes we get into trouble. When we're teaching enrolled students for our universities or other teaching organizations, Those activities fall pretty squarely in fair use. But as soon as we're engaging in any kind of other commercial activity, fair use really does not apply. And think about if you are making content for a journal or scientific organization, those are often commercial entities, even if they are nonprofits, and fair use does not really apply there. Or if you're teaching for, a meeting or a course, there's often money that changes hands there, and so that is often commercial activity. One other kind of unique problem we're getting into in the era of the pandemic is online or reproducible instruction. So if you make content that others can access in a repeatable fashion, like on-demand videos, YouTube videos, TikToks, really anything where they can just click on it and play it over and over again, that's really considered broadcasting. And we don't usually think of ourselves as broadcasters, but whenever there's content that's going out on the internet and is on-demand reproducible, that's considered broadcasting. So if you're doing an online class for students and that happens at a scheduled time and it ends, and even though there may be a video record, it was part of an in-person or time-limited event, that usually is still considered education. But if you make flipped classroom style videos where students can just access it at any time during a week or things like that, that's really broadcasting. And when your content is broadcasting, you don't really enjoy very many fair use protections at all. So in general, if the content you're making is for a slide deck or a lecture where you know the names of the people in your audience and they are enrolled students in your educational institution, probably you can make good use of fair use protections for the copyrighted content in your presentation. And if they're not, you should really expect not to be able to do that. And so you should be very careful about how you add extra content that belongs to others to your presentations. Video and audio have much less fair use protection, so it's harder to use video and audio that are not yours in your presentations. And this really, again, gets into the broadcasting part. If you take video and audio and make it a part of your presentation such that someone could click on it and, again, get that video or audio and not be linked back to the original creators, you're rebroadcasting, and that's a clear copyright violation. So if you're going to use video and audio, you want to link or embed that content in your slide deck so that someone would have to go to YouTube or go to TikTok to access that video. And that way the original creator will get credit and also control of that. For example, if they took it down, you wouldn't have access to it anymore. And that's what the copyright protections are for. When you're doing that, if you're going to play that for your students, it's generally limited to face-to-face instruction. And that could include, again, a scheduled class, online, like a Zoom class or things, but would not include on-demand instruction. So if you were doing a flipped classroom style course and you wanted to include someone else's YouTube content, the best way to do that would be just to have a link in that module for them to click on and go to YouTube to view that content. Same thing for audio, unless the audio recordings are in the public domain, those are copyright protected. So again, best practices, face-to-face classes, embed the videos, don't copy them and put them in as actual video or audio files, and then always give credit to the source. All right, so at this point we've gone through what is copyright. Copyright is a privilege for the creator of a work that exists once it's created, and at that point they have control over how it should be used. And so if you have work from other people, including journal articles or art or anything really that you did not individually create, you need to have a way to get that into your presentation that is friendly. So either we need direct permission from that creator, or we're about to look at some other ways to find content where creators have already given away or given permission for their copyrighted content to be used. The most accessible and perhaps the best model as we move into the future for copyright control is the Creative Commons license. Creative Commons is a nonprofit organization of their own which has developed a number of copyright licenses for people to use to share their content. So for example, most open access journals are sharing that content under a Creative Commons license that allows you to access it, but not, totally reuse it or republish it or things like that. If you search for Creative Commons content on any search engine online, you'll be able to find all kinds of artwork, clip art, line art, all sorts of things that you can use in your presentations that are very easy to cite the license for. And so when I do that for my presentations, I may add that graphic to my slide, and then from the source where I found the graphic, it will tell me how to cite the license. Sometimes I just need to say this is by so-and-so at this website. Sometimes I don't need to say anything, but the particular source will let you know how to cite that license. There are a number of great online sources for high quality photos, icons, fonts. I've listed some of them here, and at any of these sites you can just go to the About section of the website. It will tell you what the license is and how to cite it in your presentation if you're going to reuse it, and also what limitations there are for reusing it. For example, sometimes there may be a limitation that you cannot use this content for commercial purposes. So, using that in something that's going to be for an organization that's charging fees would be inappropriate. However, for teaching for your nonprofit university, usually that would be appropriate. There's lots of content also that's in the public domain. So this content has no copyright restrictions at all. Anything created for the United States government is going to be in the public domain. That would include government-funded research. So that content is in the public domain. And there are many public domain repositories, including the Library of Congress, which has lots of audio and video content and photo content that you can use in your lectures, and you just need to Google that. I find that for my own teaching, it is often best to just make your own. And sometimes, especially if you're not an artist, it can be somewhat frustrating to have visuals that are maybe not quite as professional as some things that you could find on the internet. But for a lot of cases, finding those things are just not accessible, especially if you are a specialist in a pretty specialized area of the health sciences or biology. You may have particular kinds of diagrams or other things that just really don't exist outside of your own lab. And in that case, drawing your own presentations, or even in special cases, hiring an artist to make you really nice ones, is a great way to get a piece of work that you control the copyright for, that you have all the permissions for, and can use as often as you like. So I would say if you're doing, a lecture for medical students, for example, that happens every year, it may be worth it for certain things to make sure you get, high quality graphics that you control the copyright for as you're going ahead. A couple of other ways you can do that. Oftentimes I will just draw things with like a felt tip pen that photographs really well, and then I can just bring it into the slide software, take the background out, and I'll have a illustration. And also in all the slide software, there's opportunities to use shapes to really draw a bunch of different things, and the drawing tools in slide software can be another great way to make diagrams and things. So here's just a couple of examples from my own slides. This is a lecture on pyloric stenosis, and I needed to show roughly where the organs are that we're scanning with the ultrasound probe, and also kind of where on the body we're placing the ultrasound probe. And so in this particular picture, I have used the shape tools to make a little pretend ultrasound probe, and then I used a tablet with some art software just to draw the outline of the abdomen and the little dotted line for the rib margin, and then the belly button in. And all my fellows and students know that this little G belly button is kind of my own signature style for when I draw abdomen diagrams. And from another lecture I did on ketamine for acute pain, in that particular lecture I just used a pen and some art software to go ahead and draw these on paper, and then I photographed them in and just colored them in with the art software to get the colors on them. And then again, I can use these as often as I want for anything that I want. And I have reused a lot of these diagrams or illustrations in other lectures. All right, so at this point, you either know that you need to get permission from a copyright owner, or you've found things which may have various other copyright permissions like Creative Commons or public domain. And so when we add those things to our slide decks, we just need to make sure we document what kinds of permissions we have. And especially going forward, as more and more organizations ask authors to either attest that they have all the permissions for the content in their slide decks, or ask you to actually make sure you have documented in the slides where your content is coming from, this gets to be more and more important. So in cases where you need to place a copyright declaration on the slide, like I had on my last slide there with my copyright in the bottom right-hand corner. You want to put that near the content, so you can't put it way off somewhere else on the page, and it should have text that's a similar size to the other text on the slide, so you can't make it microscopic and unreadable. I often will make it a couple of point sizes smaller than most of the rest of the text, but pretty similar in size. For different kinds of content, you might not have to put any attestation. So for example, some of the photo sharing sites I showed earlier, you do not need to have any copyright attestations or permissions on the slides. They are free to use without making that. And I always will usually keep a link to where I found the content and any additional information in the slide notes. So that way, even if I don't have to have the copyright permissions on the slide itself, if someone were to ask me, I would be able to tell them where the image came from and why I don't need permissions for it. Okay, so we're about to wrap up here, and so we're going to take just a slight detour and talk a little bit about using health-related information on your slides in particular. And especially in the health sciences, it's not unusual to include either case-type information or other information which originally came from an actual patient encounter in healthcare. And it's really important to make sure that that information is well removed from your slides, and there are a couple of pitfalls people fall into that really you need to avoid. First of all, it's important to remember that this patient information can come in many different forms, and so it's not just a patient name or medical record number, but if there's information, for example, on medical images that identifies the facility or the time and date, that would also be considered identifying information. And so a good rule of thumb is there should be nothing more localizing than maybe a state, and certainly not any time or date or facility information on the image, as well as removing, of course, any patient name or medical record number. It's important when you go to remove that from pictures or videos that you don't just mask out that information using the tools in your presentation software, but that you actually physically remove it from the file. And the best way to do that is to use a photo or video editor to crop that content and then render it as a new file. So for example, in a photo editor, I would crop a photo to remove anything identifying and then save as that into a new file. That has the added advantage of removing any metadata, so that stuff that's stored in the file that would tell, for example, like what camera took the photo or things like that. We want all of that stripped out so that that is not hidden identifying information that's lingering along with the file. So again, don't use shapes inside your slide software to mask those things out. Those can be removed by anyone who gets access to the slide deck itself, the original file, and then your patient info would be disclosed. So we do not want to do that. Another great rule of thumb is to not share the actual file with your audience. So if you're at a meeting and one of the options is to give the audience access to your slide deck, you want to make sure that that's shared as a PDF, that your audience doesn't have access to the actual slide file itself. A lot of healthcare professionals, especially physicians, expect to use the patient consent that the patients sign when they present for treatment as permission to use patient content or HIPAA information from that visit in presentations. And I will say, at least for our own institution, that is not actually what that patient consent for educational involvement in their care is attesting to. So if you are ever not sure if the patient-derived things in your slide deck are permissible, the best rule of thumb is to get permission from the patient specifically. And our institution, for example, has a multimedia patient HIPAA disclosure form that can be signed that we can use for that. If you do have to edit your videos or photos to remove this patient information, do not use online tools. So we do not want to load or upload photos or videos to the internet for a internet-based editor to crop that and then download the file back. So those things all have to be done on your computer, preferably on your work computer, to kind of crop out and then make the new patient privacy compliant file. I had on the previous slide there are a couple of good photo tools The GIMP is a Photoshop style tool that's cross-platform, so really on any operating system it'll work. And then if you're on Mac OS, Preview works well, and then Windows Paint or Photos are available to crop your photos. And then video-wise, it's a little bit trickier, but both Mac and Windows have some options there. One that's widely used is Handbrake. It's not very straightforward to use, but once you get the hang of it, you can kind of batch things. So if you have a number of video files you need to crop in the same way, you can just load them all in and it will just run through them. All right, so that's kind of the broad strokes of being copyright compliant. So let's take a look at a couple of slides here that I've made up, and we'll take a look at what might be copyrighted content, and then how are we going to kind of manage that so that we have a copyright compliant presentation. So here we've got the snotty toddler. This is kind of a case presentation, and we've got a picture of this cute kiddo here. And you can see that with the picture, we've gone ahead and listed a credit of where this photo came from that's compliant with that website's licensing agreement. And again, if we're not sure, we just go to the help or about area of the website, and they'll tell us what their license is. Also in the bottom left, you may not think of it, but there's this icon here. This icon of some pills, and that is also copyrighted creative content. In this case, this comes from an online free-to-use library, and I have documented that in the slide notes. So in the slide notes, it says where that icon came from and what permissions it has. So this is great. This is a compliant slide, and it still looks good. It's got some flair. So here is a slide about wisdom teeth, and so again, this is kind of a medical education slide that's using this radiology image. And you can see here, unfortunately, the slide creator tried to do a shortcut by bringing this box over the name and medical record number, and I just moved it off, and we can see that that information is still there. So that's not great. Anyone who got access to the slide deck could uncover that and get the patient information for this slide. So better would be to go through a image editor and actually crop that out. And then also I have listed where it came from. Should any third party, like a conference organizer or someone, ask me if I have permission for this, I can say, yeah, this is my own image from my own kind of image library. And then here's one that's a little bit more technical. So you're running a lab, you teach maybe more fundamental biochemistry type content. So this is a picture about the Krebs cycle, and without the diagram, it's a little bit harder to understand. And so in this case, I went online to find a resource for this flow or cycle diagram that was copyright compliant. So I just kind of Googled, copyright permissions, Krebs cycle, and was able to find this image from Catherine Humphreys, and I gave the citation for it that the site asked for. Here's another example of a teaching style technical medical slide deck where we're going to talk about this article here. And although I have a citation for it, this is kind of on the edge of fair use. So I have reproduced the entire first page of this article, and there's not really a reason to do that as far as the technical need for teaching. I don't need to show this. I'm certainly not going to editorially go through all of the paragraphs in this first page of the article. It would be much better to just take the title, if I really needed to, and then make my comment about what I want to say about this. And that way I can limit the amount of content that I'm reusing and keep it focused. And then again, I have a citation in the bottom right, so anyone could find that content if they needed it. So at this point, we've been through copyright. Hopefully I have helped you understand a little bit better, both about how copyright affects us and the sort of ways where oftentimes, unfortunately, our slide decks are not copyright compliant. And at this point, you may be thinking, I have like 30 slide decks, and how would I ever get through them all to make them copyright compliant? So we'll look a little bit about specifics, and then we'll talk about kind of the broader strategy for that. So if you have a particular slideshow that you need to fix, one way to kind of start working on those images or the other content that's there is to just kind of save that photo out and then use a service like Google Images to upload the photo and have Google look for photos that are like it. So you can find out where it's from, maybe find a copyright compliant version of it, or at least be able to credit the source originally. And then PowerPoint, you would just right click on a picture and then hit save as picture and then upload that to Google. Here's a particular image looking at sodium homeostasis and the hamburger epidemic. And here I have a little clip art guy, and actually my X is not supposed to be there yet. But he's probably coming from somebody's slide deck or somebody's website in terms of clip art. And then I have this, very technical hamburger kidney processing image by Dr. Glass. And if I was to make this compliant, a couple of ways I could go would be to find some clip art inside of my slide software. So for example, PowerPoint has access to a pretty broad range of clip art and stock photos that you can use as long as you're on a business or institutional license for Microsoft Office. And then in terms of the diagram, I could always search for a copyright-friendly diagram that gets the process across, or I could use drawing software or just ink and paper to go ahead and make my own version of that diagram. And in fact, this diagram, although not the best work I've ever done, was made just with the image tools inside of PowerPoint. And then lastly, again, this Krebs cycle image, let's say we couldn't find a copyright-friendly version of the Krebs cycle. Again, pen and ink is one way to get the job done if you really need to. But again, there might be a great reason if you're a lab that does this kind of, that has a specialty in this kind of biochemistry, you may want to go ahead and get a medical illustrator at your medical school or someone else to make a copyright-friendly version for you that you will reuse over and over again. And there are also online websites if you don't have access to that kind of instructional support. So again, librarians are very helpful in terms of finding someone who can help make this diagram or a copyright-friendly version of it. If your university has instructional and design staff, often they can help. And then there's paid services that will do this. For example, one that is very accessible is BioRender, BioRender, and they specialize in tools to make technical medical diagrams like this. And so that fixes one deck, but if you have like 30 decks, you're like, oh my gosh, I mean, this is just too much to go back and fix. Some of these decks maybe are 10 or 15 years old. And so my recommendations here are to, one, just try to turn over a new leaf. As you make new slide decks, as you make slides, think about, would this be copyright compliant? How widely can I use this slide deck in this modern age of digital sharing and copyright concerns? So on your next slide deck, keep that in mind. And then triage your old slide decks. If you have a slide deck that you're giving often, especially at outside organizations, that one probably needs to be copyright compliant. If you have a slide deck that you pull out once every couple of years for a specialty lecture, you can let that one be the last one that you fix. And then summing it all up, everything has some sort of copyright permissions. In fact, your slide deck is copyright of you after you've made it. And so you really should be looking at all the content in your slide deck and wondering if that person who made that photo that you use on slide number 3 saw that get out on YouTube and everyone was screenshotting it and stealing it, would they be upset? And if they would, you should probably try to find something that is more copyright friendly. It's possible to create really good presentations that are entirely copyright compliant. So again, for my presentations for the last several years have been entirely copyright friendly, and it just requires a little bit of intention to do that. And then overall, when we're looking at copyright, we want to be on the right side of the law, and that also opens up opportunities for you to share your content more widely. You can make that YouTube video that goes viral. You can share your slides across organizations. You can publish your slide deck for something like MedEd Portal. And then when we're documenting permissions in our slides, we just want to make sure we do a good job of that. Make sure that they're on the slide, easily readable, and that we also keep tracking the slide notes for things that don't need to be on the slide itself. If you have any questions, I'd love to hear them. If you have comments, if you want to roast me for this lecture, you can find me on Twitter, or I will be happy to answer emails. And I hope that you have the best of luck as you try to make your presentations copyright compliant. Thanks.